Hi, sophomores. This is Dr. Bradley with a talk on the connection between territorial expansion in the West and the controversy over slavery. Enjoy! The West and the slavery controversy. What is the connection? So before we get to the specifics, let's work with a prelude. Can you name the presidents from Monroe to Lincoln? The presidents were James Monroe, Democrat, Republican; John Quincy Adams, also Democrat, Republican; Andrew Jackson, Democrat; Martin Van Buren, Democrat; William Henry Harrison, Whig, who died in 1841 and was succeeded by John Tyler, also a Whig; James Polk, Democrat; Zachary Taylor, Whig, who died in 1850 and was succeeded by Millard Fillmore, also a Whig; James Pierce, Democrat; James Buchanan, Democrat. Franklin Pierce, Democrat; James Buchanan, Democrat; and Abraham Lincoln, Republican. The Missouri Compromise sets the scene. Was this the last real compromise? Let's take a look at the map. National harmony began to crumble in 1819 when Missouri applied for statehood. Here's Missouri. Bitter debate over the spread of slavery sprang up for the first time. Abolitionism had begun. Admitting Missouri as a slave state would upset the balance of 11 free and 11 slave states in the Senate, giving the South a political advantage. So in 1820, Congress approved the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and Maine, way up here, was admitted as a free state. It had previously been part of Massachusetts. In the remainder of the Louisiana Territory, which was this territory over here, slavery would be permitted only south of 36 degrees 30 minutes of latitude, the southern boundary of Missouri. As we have discussed numerous times in class, how the North and the South were developing very different economic lives. And here what I want to say is that manifest destiny and technological expansion go hand in hand. In the 1820s, a system of the steam engine, the steam canal barge was developed, and this led to a massive burst in canal building, which improved east-to-west transportation. In the 1830s, the steam-driven railway engine was developed, and so there was a burst in railroad buildings. In both of these cases, the majority of these routes were developed in the northern states. As we can see from this map of railroads railroads built in 1850 and 1860, which is not an ideal map, but nonetheless, it helps you to see that even eliminating canals and just looking at railroads, you can see how many more of them were being built in the northern states than were being built in the southern states. In the South, meanwhile, King Cotton grew up in the 1830s. It was also massively profitable, but it was based on agriculture. Immigration and birth rates soared. Immigration in the North and birth rates in both sections developed. In the West, we saw the California gold rush in the 1840s, and everywhere from San Francisco to Chicago to Philadelphia and New York, we see cities on the rise. Not in the South, meanwhile. In the 1830s, the pioneering spirit that began with the earliest covered wagons families exploring routes westward, morphed over time into a more belligerent attitude that we came to know as manifest destiny. Horace Greeley, founder and editor of the New York Tribune, is known to have begun the phrase "Go west, young man," which became the byword for westward migration. There was a race to claim land and a competitive spirit among Americans moving westward. And expansionism became politically popular, as seen in particular in the presidential campaign of James Polk in 1844. In his campaign, Polk promised two expansionist things. First, that he would claim the Northwest Territory. The slogan was 54-40 or fight. I'll show you a map of that in a moment. And he promised that he would annex Texas as soon as he took office. So here's our first example of westward expansion, actually in the east, but the Indian removal of the 1830s. Nearly 50,000 Native Americans were removed from the southeast to what was then called Indian Territory and would later become Oklahoma. Here's our second example of manifest destiny. This was the line of latitude 5440 you see right here that Polk was referring to in his 1844 presidential campaign, when he swore that he would take all of this territory from the British and claim it for the United States. As we know, that's not what ultimately happened. In 1846, the United States made a peaceful treaty with Great Britain, agreeing to divide the Northwest Territory into a part that became Washington State and Oregon, and the other part that was ceded to Great Britain. In this map, which is called Western Trails, it tracks the early travels of pioneers in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s from the current-day Midwest, but the outer edges of the Mississippi River area, across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. These trails would form the foundation for the flood of people who would then follow in the 1840s. This map shows us the Texas Revolution of 1835 and 1836, which led to the independent Republic of Texas, which remained so until it was annexed by the United States in 1845. The War of Independence of the Republic of Texas was won at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836. And then in 1846 to 1848, the United States fought a war which we started against Mexico, that the United States won, and led to this very substantial Mexican cession by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that completed the territorial expansion of the United States across the continental United States. You are all very well familiar with this map, and you see now why it's so important. And so there's a huge connection between slavery and all of this westward expansion. So what does all this have to do with slavery? Well, it's important on several grounds. First of all, it was an economic issue. Can a family farmer trying to set up a homestead in Kansas or Colorado or California compete with a cotton plantation owner who uses slave labor? Westward expansion was a moral issue. As U.S. territory expanded, would the evil of slavery be spread or would it be contained? It was also a political issue. Since the Missouri Compromise line did not technically apply to land acquired from Mexico, how was slavery going to be dealt with in the newly acquired territories? Let me show you that. So here is the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise, but you see it stops here because in 1821 this was the edge of the Louisiana Purchase, and so this territory belonged to Mexico and this was undecided, and so the question was, well, does this line extend into the cession from Mexico or not? And of course that became a huge debate. The issue of westward expansion and slavery was also a constitutional issue. Did the contract theory of government apply, or did the compact theory of government apply? The contract theory said the same laws should apply to everybody in the country, and the compact theory was the Jeffersonian states' rights theory. And finally, the issue of westward expansion and slavery was a fundamental national identity issue. Can you actually have a country where some of the states allow slavery and others do not? Because this speaks to the question of how you define a person. So the 1850s are nicknamed the critical decade because they are the decade that began with the so-called Compromise of 1850, which was not really a compromise, and ended with the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of South Carolina, which led quickly downhill to the outbreak of the Civil War in April of 1861. So let me show you two of the key geographic efforts to forestall crisis that were fruitless efforts. The Compromise of 1850 was originally designed as a package deal, but it failed to pass the Senate, and so it was represented as separate bills that were passed. And so that's why historians say it wasn't really a compromise. But the 5 pieces of the package that were passed separately were as follows. California was admitted as a free state to the Union. The remaining Western territories were organized with no restrictions on slavery, so that would be all of these territories. Slave trade was ended, internal and international slave trade in the District of Columbia was now illegal. A strict federal fugitive slave law was passed. This means that if a slave from Mississippi escaped into a state such as Illinois, which banned slavery, federal fugitive slave law required citizens of Illinois to capture that slave and return it to its owners. This was deeply offensive to anti-slavery states. And finally, Texas's debt was assumed by the national government. You can see that some of the aspects of the Compromise of 1850, for example, the admission of California as a free state, it crosses the line of 3630. It's a really big state. It was a center of the gold rush. That was a huge boon for the anti-slavery states. But then on the other hand, the passage of the federal fugitive slave law was a boon to the slave interests. So the Compromise of 1850 really did have something for both sides, but didn't make either side happy. In 1854, the issue of slavery arose again when Kansas and Nebraska Territory declared themselves ready to organize governments and form states. And the question arose again, would these territories organize as allowing slavery or not? Let's look at that map. So in both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850, a new concept arose as to try to resolve the slavery issue in Western territories. And this was the concept of popular sovereignty. What this meant was that people who advocated popular sovereignty said, we should let the people living in these territories vote as to whether they want their states to be allowing slavery or not when the time to organize statehood arrives. This sounds like states' rights theory. It makes sense. It's what the people want. But as you can see, the Kansas Territory, Nebraska Territory, and Utah Territory were all solidly north of the Missouri Compromise line. And if they all became slave states ultimately, it meant that the pro-slave interests would have a strong majority in the Senate. So it was deeply concerning to anti-slavery interests. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 began to organize these areas into territories, which is the first step to statehood. And in that act, these territories were both potentially open to slavery because the issue of slavery would be set up by popular sovereignty. In 1856, in fact, Kansas, which was carved out of Kansas Territory, was ready to organize as a state, and there were pro-slavery and anti-slavery interests involved there, and they had an election and ultimately formed two governments, a pro-slavery government and an anti-slavery government, and a miniature civil war broke out in Kansas in 1856, which was nicknamed Bleeding Kansas, when the different forces fought to the death about whether Kansas would be allowing slavery or not. The issue was not resolved until the Civil War began in 1861, and Kansas was admitted to the Union as a free state once the slavery interests had seceded from the Union. This is the end of the talk on the connection of the West and the slavery controversy and explaining the very huge connection between those two. And we'll pick up the discussion in class with the Kansas-Nebraska Act up to 1860. See you later.